Thank you for that very warm welcome, and also for inviting me to be here with you today. Registrar support is something that I feel like is a calling or passion of mine, for reasons I'll explain in a few seconds. But thank you for having me here today, and it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with all of you. I'm going to focus on academic publishing, which I think for newcomers into the academic world can be quite a black box and quite an overwhelming sort of, task to try and wrap our heads around. So I hope that through the sessions with you today that you'll have a better understanding of some of the challenges that you might encounter, but also how to navigate the process once you get there. So as LZ mentioned, I'm currently the head of the Registrar Support Office at Stellenbosch University, and I'm so encouraged to see the amount of support that's growing across the country for registrars and their research projects. And I think just having this session today is testament to that. And a huge thank you to the organizers for offering something like this and for having me to join. So as mentioned, I trained as a scientist, but it just wasn't a great fit for me, and maybe I should have left before I did a whole PhD in it. And in some ways I do miss the work that I was doing in microbiology, but really my heart has always been with education and also with writing. My primary love is for language and writing, but during my PhD, when I was working as a writing consultant, I had a student walk into my office And I just couldn't understand why this master's student was struggling with this project so much until he told me the story about, he's a registrar, this is the situation at the HPCSA. And, we're all kind of just having a meltdown about these projects. And I thought, this is ridiculous. We need more support for these guys. So it really became like I latched onto this problem, and I felt like this is something that I really wanted to contribute to. And so through that journey of moving to psychiatry, where I started fully focusing on MMed research, and then fought really hard for my post to be developed at Stellenbosch, where I am currently. So even though I've got a slightly different background to you, I've also struggled with research. A PhD can really put you through the mill. I fully understand the pressure that one goes through working on top of it, having a family. So I guess in that instance, I have some insight into the struggles that each of you deals with. And I also work as a freelance writer and editor because those are the things that I love as well. And I love designing online courses. So if anyone's out there that wants any advice, I'm happy to provide that in addition to any other research support. So I'm punting stuff that's available at Stellenbosch University, and I'm all about free sharing and open source. So I draw your attention to a little handbook, which is on my website, which is called Getting Started in Clinical Research. And it's just an ebook. It's a crash course introduction into research, and specifically designed for registrars. So it's your people. Welcome you to attend some of the webinars that I offer. Also available to anyone who would like to learn a little more about research, specifically targeted to medical officers and registrars. And I offer these once a month on a Tuesday evening between 7:30 and 8:30. So if you keep an eye on my website, you can register for those and attend. It would be lovely to have you there. All right, so Brenda spoke this morning about the importance of Master of Medicine research, and I think that's a really important thing to just lay the foundation for why you guys are all here and having to struggle through this thing. But there are a number of different competencies that we try to nurture and to develop during your specialist training. And one of the frameworks that I use as an educator for that is this thing called the CanMeds framework. So you can see all the different competencies and skills that we develop as part of the specialist program. And perhaps the most neglected so far in the South African context has been the scholar role. And we're trying harder and harder to help registrars see the link between doing research and how this filters into your ability to practice evidence based medicine. And what we mean by that scholarly competence is that you are committing to lifelong learning. So you'd be reading the literature, keeping abreast of the latest developments within your field. And along with that would be your ability to critically appraise what you're reading and be able to then translate that and apply it in your decision or the decisions you need to make in your everyday practice. We're not trying to make researchers out of everybody, but there is a huge need for research capacity amongst clinicians on the African continent to create knowledge, scientific information that really is contextualized to the healthcare challenges within our continent. So of course, for those who are really keen to continue with research after their specialist time, having this taster during your MMed will allow you to better create and disseminate new information that you contribute to as you move further in your careers. So I've just for my sins completed an MPhil in health professions education, as well as starting a new office and living through a pandemic and buying a new home. And so again, I think that also gives some insight. It really helped me refocus and just give me a newfound or reminder to appreciate the struggles that you guys go through in dealing with everything that life throws at us. But the focus of my research was on the value of MMed research. And this was born out of discussions I had with my registrars around, okay, so now that this thing is done, and you moaned and complained the whole way through, and it was really hard, but what are you taking away? And it was that conversation that I really wanted to explore. And I got a lovely group of surgical registrars, and I had a conversation with them. And these are the types of things that came up as part of that exploration. So they have a deeper understanding of how evidence is generated, how research is and scientific evidence is produced, a greater confidence to conduct further research, not always necessarily on their own, but definitely able to better navigate the process in the future. What I really loved is that they felt that their reading and critical appraisal skills improved, which of course is that direct link to evidence-based practice. And they even demonstrated or could tell me stories about how they had used this sort of mentoring into the research space to make clinical decisions and also to argue within the academic conversations that were taking place, during studying for exams. And of course, publications. It's academic gold, and I'll speak more about this obviously as we go through, but having publications on your CV helps you be competitive in the job market, and we're seeing that even at the medical officer level. And at Stellenbosch University, we offer an incentive for publishing. So we pay out 5,000 Rand if you manage to publish your research while you're still a student. So they also commented on that extra pocket money. And there's also immense personal satisfaction in overcoming the research journey. And it's really painful. I feel it too. With every project that I do, I think, why have I done this? And also sometimes voluntarily. But there is such great pride and personal satisfaction when you see your publication out there and being shared with, gone through that process of planning a study, executing it, and getting to this stage of navigating the publication process and seeing your work out there. So that's really what I'm going to be speaking about today, is that end part of the MMed, assuming that you've collected your data and you analyze it and you're getting ready for examination or publication, and getting you a bit closer to being able to have a big celebration for overcoming that. There are two things I want to share with you today. The first is to explain the business of academic publishing. If it feels like a black box to you, that's okay. When I first came into the academic space, it was a big black box. I'm still learning things about the publication industry, which, it's a constant evolution of this great big beast. So I want to try and demystify that for you. And then also to give you some practical tips for navigating the process when you get there, some tips, some pitfalls or things to look out for, and things to help you get through that journey. All right, so there's just two things that, we should just make sure we're all on the same page here about what is a journal and what do we mean by peer review? Because obviously these words are going to come up a couple of times as I'm going through this presentation. An academic or scholarly journal is a publication where scholars and academics will submit their work, and it's a conversation. So we submit our work into this academic community, and we expect that peer reviewers will take a look at it and really review and comment on the rigor of the science and the contribution that it's making, and provide feedback to the authors so that they can strengthen the work that they're putting out into the world. So the first journal ever was in 1665, where scientists started getting together and writing, as if like writing for a newspaper and saying, hey, look, this is what I've done, and this is what I want the community to learn. And over time, it's become more and more rigorous, and this need for peer review is so important. I mean, we've seen this with the challenges during COVID-19 and some dodgy science, and it really impacts public trust in science. So this aspect of peer review is really important. It just means that your work is being evaluated by a group of experts and is vetted and saying, okay, this is cool, you're allowed to share this with the world and it's not going to damage anything. Why publish? This is a very important question. Why can't we just get the damn MMed done and move on with our lives after it's been examined? Why is this pressure? Why is there pressure to publish? The first reason is that we have a sort of personal and ethical obligation to share our research. If we've poked and prodded patients, we need to uphold their dignity by making the findings that we've got from that poking and prodding available to the rest of the world. And you're all going to be contributing something to science, whether it's a small step forward, even if it's just a retrospective review article or something, a little bit bigger. Each and every one of you is going to be making a step forward. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And why not share that with the world? And writing is the primary mechanism through which we are joining a scholarly community, where we are sharing our message with the scholarly community. So writing is an important skill for us as academics. And then publishing is that way of sharing our message with the world. There's this quote that says, unread science is lost science. And I was chatting with a colleague a few days ago, and he said that there are two papers that he worked on maybe 2 years back that have never been published, and they're kind of just sitting on his desk. And he did a lot of work for that, some really lovely outcomes, but it's on his desk. No one is seeing it, so it's lost in a way. So we want to share our message with the community, to contribute to the conversation, tell researchers how we're developing or moving things forward. We want to promote rigorous evidence and contributions. And remember what I said about contributing to the evidence base that's contextualized to the African needs. I think that's really important, but also making sure that we are contributing good science. And for those of you who want to continue with research and perhaps want to get into the academic space, have that dual affiliation, you might want to become a thought leader within your area of expertise. And you become a thought leader by having your voice growing louder and louder and sharing more things within that scholarly community. What I see amongst supervisors and, of course, MMed candidates like we are here sharing our stories is that it motivates and inspires other early career researchers. So I guess we also have that obligation, if we're nurturing new people into the field, that we set that example. And I've already mentioned it's very rewarding and a great boost to our self-confidence. But unfortunately, there are also these negative elements that come with publishing. And there's this horrible saying called publish or perish. If you're not publishing, you're going to perish in academia. So there's a lot of competition to be who's publishing the most, who's having the most impact in the field. And these sorts of things become really important in discussions about who's going to get promotions or funding. And so it comes down to where you're publishing, and I'll speak about that in a bit, but the impact factors of journals. So, which are the sexy journals to be publishing, like Nature. Everyone wants to be able to say on their CV that they've published in Nature. And also, we get a metric as academics. It makes me think of an episode in Black Mirror. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it was like if everyone lived in the social world and your interactions on social media and Facebook, that you could be scored as a person, and your score can drop. It's like Uber, man. Don't we get scored by our Uber drivers? And it's the same in academia. We get this thing called an H index, or there are other metrics, but it shows how much impact you have on the field. And obviously, the greater the impact, the better your promotion. And it's all academic gold for more funding, promotions, or whatever the case might be. And that competition and that pressure is really overwhelming in the academic space, and something to just bear in mind as you move forward. What I mean by impact factors is every journal will have their own metric, and it just tells us about the influence that journal has in the academic community. How important is that journal? How is it ranking in comparison to other journals? So obviously, the higher the impact factor, the more influential the journal. So things like the Lancet or Nature or Science, they're going to have really high impact factors. And then things like the SAMJ, typically more local journals, will have lower impact factors, and also new journals that come onto the scene will start off on low impact. And as more people read them and cite them, their impact factors will grow. It's based on the number of citations that journal has. So is the work in that journal relevant? Is it being cited? And that pushes the impact up. So it's just a gross approximation of the journal's prestige and the readership that's following it. I'll speak about impact factors as a key consideration when choosing a journal a little bit later. So just hold that in mind for now. And I've mentioned this metric called the H index, which is a measure of our own impact on the field. And I think reducing a person to a number is quite something, but it also relates to the number of times your publications have been cited. So luckily for me, I published with a really big researcher recently. And because that paper is being published so often, my H index has increased by 1 point. So it's that sort of game that you need to play within academia to see how you can boost that measure. Don't get bogged down by that. I think that's something the hardcore researchers will get into if you're really trying to become a thought leader and carve out an academic space. But at an MMed level, I wouldn't worry too much about this. Just be aware that that's out there and part of the publishing sort of industry. There's another aspect of the pressure to publish, and that is because there are financial advantages for specifically South African universities. So the Department of Higher Education and Training will give the universities money for every student that the university graduates. So there's this push to graduate more and more doctoral candidates. And we also get subsidies for every publication. And a couple of years ago, I believe it was 100,000 Rand per paper if it was in an accredited journal. So it's one of the major income streams for the university. If we don't have our researchers publishing, we lose a lot of money, and it keeps things going within our institutions. So each of your publications is going to boost our income at the university level. The question is, do you ever get paid for that? So now we start seeing how the publication business model sort of functions and who it's benefiting along the way. Let's look at those business models for a second. There are journals or publishing houses that rely on a traditional subscription-based model. where the authors will sometimes, not always, pay to have their work published, right? It's ridiculous that we do all the work and we still have to pay for our stuff to be published. And then the readers always pay to access that work. So I'm sure you've come across something like this when you're looking for a paper and it says you can only read the abstract and the title, and if you want to read more, you have to pay, crazy amounts of money to read it. So that's what I mean by subscription based. The reader will have to pay to access that. We then have increasingly this open access journal model, which also aligns with my values for sharing, having a work out there and easily accessible to everybody. But the authors pay large sums of money to publish in open access journals. I'll share some of that with you in a second. But then it means that the readers can access the articles for free. Of course, then there are the hybrid journals, so you can decide if you want to pay to publish or not. If you do pay, then the reader can access for free, but if you don't pay, then the reader has to pay. So this is how the journals are bringing in their money using these different publication models. And so just on this open access issue is that you don't need to pay to access journals. If you're affiliated with a university, your library will have paid for subscription. So that money that's coming in for subsidies will get used to pay the journals so that their students can read and access the articles. So take a trip to the library. If you found a paper that you think is the most important paper to cite for your work, take a trip to the library and ask a librarian to help you get access to that. And there are also other tips and tricks. I've got a colleague in London, and if I can't find a paper, I ask him if he can get it through his institution. So make use of your networks as well. Right, so how much money are we paying to publish our articles? The average processing charges amount to about 45,000 Rand per article. The SAMJ charges about 7,000 Rand, but there are other local journals, like I'm thinking about the South African Journal of Psychiatry, which has no charges for anyone on the African continent. If you've got an African affiliation, you don't need to pay anything. So the most expensive MMed article that I was involved with was the head of department paid 75,000 Rand for an MMed study, which sort of makes my eyes water. And the question comes down a little bit later when you think about when we choose journals, of who's going to pay for that. You think about the supervisors that you have or might potentially have. Do they have the publication funds to pay for these things? And if not, what are the other funding sources within your university to help you pay for this? And this is a debate we can perhaps have afterwards if you want to stick around. A good resource to keep on hand is the DOAJ website, which is a repository or a list of all the journals out there. You can filter by pediatrics or by specific disciplines, but there is also a filter where you can choose no charges. And I do this because I'm still an emerging academic. I click on all the journals that have no charges and I have a look at them, check that they're accredited, and then submit there until I've built up some of my own research funding. Of course, where there is money involved, there are going to be the scammers and the swindlers. And you might have heard of something called predatory publishing. And this is where the swindlers come in. They exploit the business model of academic publishing because they know that researchers are willing to pay 75,000 Rand to publish their article. So why not exploit that? And they're also exploiting the academics' need for recognition. We need to publish for our careers. So we're willing to pay 75,000 Rand to make that happen. They'll charge the authors, but they don't provide the rigorous journal. So you'll see the crazy things like they offer you 4-day peer review, probably doesn't even go through peer review. They don't hear from them again. So it's a another one of the dark aspects of the publishing world. The driving forces breed. They run away with your money, and there's very little you can do once you started chatting with a predatory journal. There are more than 12,000 of them, and the number grows every day. I'm actually, I sound quite cynical this morning, but I wish that I'd thought of this first. It's a clever idea, and but horrific for our careers. You can get predatory publishing houses. So you might be familiar with things like Taylor and Francis or Sage journals. So it's one big publishing house that has multiple journals within that. So you can have a predatory publisher. You can also have predatory standalone journals. So some random journal will pop up that's predatory. And also hijacked journals, where they'll say this is the Journal of Pediatric Neurosurgery, and you look online and there is actually a legitimate pediatric journal, but the predatory website looks similar, but there are aspects on there that make it predatory. So there are all these things that you need to be thinking about as you start publishing, and to not take things at face value. You need to think very critically about what you're seeing within the publication space. What are the consequences? Firstly, you're going to have a large bill to pay that might not come to anything. You might never see your pay out there. It's a taint on your reputation to great, because it means that you're basically saying this thing hasn't gone through peer review, it hasn't been checked. So am I upholding the ethical concerns that come with research and publishing? Of course, the biggest thing for me is that it can contaminate the medical evidence. And like some of the ridiculous things that happened during COVID-19 with dodgy journals, bad peer review, is we have dodgy science out there. And that also really fuels public distrust in science.
Sorry, Dr. Moxley.
I'll tell you a funny story. I recently bought a salt lamp, and of course on the box of the salt lamp it says, it helps the negative ions that get released by the salt lamps yes. Hello.
Hi, Dr. Moxley. Sorry, we seem to be struggling with your connection. Could you possibly turn off your video? It might help a little bit.
Is that better?
That seems to be better. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So I'm not sure what you heard last, but I was really just hammering on about the contamination of the medical evidence and fueling public distrust. Oh, yes. And I was telling you a story about a salt lamp that I bought, and it said on the salt lamp that it helps the negative ions help with health. So I decided to go down a rabbit hole and see if there was any actual evidence about that. And of course, I found evidence, but it was published in one of these dodgy journals. So, if I wasn't looking at it with a critical mind, if I was lay public or whatever, I would use that as evidence in an argument that my salt lamp is contributing to my health. As soon as you start publishing, because your email address will often be on the publication if you're the primary author, these publishers crawl and look for these email addresses and start sending you often very aggressive emails about, please, publish with us. So they look legitimate. They'll have a fancy email address. So immediately you're thinking, okay, looks legit. But then you start seeing things like really unprofessional, weird language and typos. So I hope you are doing good with happiness. It is rather strange. and they're looking for one article, and they found a paper of mine, and they know that I'm a professional in the field, and we're very impressed with the work that you've done, so appealing to my ego. But actually, I'm not a professional in psychiatry. I just happened to be on the paper because I was helping with the write-up. And then if you go a little bit deeper, if you start looking for Miss Melissa Collins, she doesn't exist anyway. She's definitely not an editor, if one does exist, for psychology and psychiatry. So this is a big red warning sign that it's a trap for a predatory journal. So if you're receiving these emails, 9 times out of 10, you can just send them straight to spam. Or like me, if you're procrastinating, you can go down the rabbit hole and start doing some research on them. And they're getting more and more clever. One that I found last night, in fact, as I was preparing, was this journal, the email that I received. And they even had a LinkedIn profile for Emma Catherine, but there's no information on there other than that she's this editorial assistant for this particular journal. Again, I've done absolutely no work in the field of neurosurgery, imaging and techniques, like nothing even close to that. So immediately, these things go to junk email every time. What are the practical things you can do to avoid these journals is, at your university, the library will have a list of all the accredited journals. And accredited means that people have gone through all the journals and checked them against a checklist for good publishing practices. So whether things go through peer review, types of behaviors or services that they offer, and all the thousands of journals out there will be checked and vetted, and this list will be updated regularly. So the library will have a copy of that, and then you can, if you found a journal, just search the spreadsheet to see if the journal appears on that accredited list. You can check the predatory journals. There's a website that also always gets updated. Every new predatory journal that pops up will be added to that list, so you can also check there. And there's another useful resource that takes you through the process of helping you decide whether something is predatory or not. So a number of steps for you to check. And checking in with your senior colleagues, your supervisors, if they've been in the academic field for a while, they'll have a sense of where to publish and what's suitable and what's dodgy. Just to emphasize that an accredited journal has gone through that peer review process, it's been vetted, the science has been checked, you're not contaminating the evidence, they're regularly evaluated. So like those new journals that come onto the market, they'll be checked every year, and they'll only be able to appear on an accredited list if they have met certain criteria over about 3 to 5 years. So just check out the DHET list. And the universities or won't get subsidies if the paper doesn't appear on the accredited list. So you're not going to get any money, well, the university is not going to get any money for a predatory publication. And a story for another day is that there are also predatory conferences. So you can get invited to a fancy conference in Switzerland and you'll pay a whole lot of money to attend. The website all looks very legit. But when you get there, no one is there to fetch you from the airport, and the conference venue is empty or doesn't exist. So that's a whole other ball game. Something else to just be aware of is chatting with colleagues and just looking for the signs for what might be a predatory conference. So this is the dark side of the academic world. All right, I'm going to let you just get up and stretch your legs for a while, and also offer the opportunity to ask me any questions about that, the business of publishing. It's really important for us as academics, but there is a dark side that we need to be aware of. And hopefully that will help you navigate and think about things more critically as you enter that stage of your research. Let's have a quick leg stretch. How's that? And come back in about 5 minutes.
Karis, is it possible to ask a question at this stage?
Of course.
My question actually relates to your comment about the sort of costs around publication. And I don't know if you're going to address that later in your talk about the sources of funding available to students at the various universities to try to address that.
Yeah, so it'll differ between universities, and of course, the bigger universities, or let's say, what are the big three, like Cape Town and Stellenbosch. I'm just using those because I'm in the Western Cape, but they're publishing so much that there is more money coming in, and that money is then available through funds that you can apply for within the institution for your own publication. So you need to find out what the publication incentives are within your environment, and offices like research capacity development will know that. Your supervisors might know, so there'll be calls at certain times of the year for you to apply for that. What you can also do is email the journal when you're submitting and say, you know, this is MMed research, we've got no funds. Would you consider waiving the fee for this publication? That's possible. I've done that before. And I'll think about it as we go through the presentation. But the other thing to mention is that your supervisors, or as you grow as an academic, you do get paid a portion into your own cost center for your publications, which you can't use for personal uses, only for publishing or attending conferences. So the more time you spend as an academic and the more you publish, you can grow those funds. And that's often what supervisors do to pay for their students.
Great.
Does
Thanks
that help?
so much, Karis. Yes, it does. And I think just, the South African Journal of Child Health, for example, is now officially affiliated with the South African Pediatric Association.
Yes.
And so just to make certainly the participants of this workshop aware of that connection, that doesn't mean an automatic entry, but just to be aware that there is a pediatric specific friendly face on the journal market here in South Africa. And so we don't always have to, as you said, aim for the highest impact factor. Sometimes we have to aim for the most sympathetic voice when you first put your foot through the door. So
exactly.
just to mention that to people.
Yes.
Correct. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think, should we pick up again at 10 past?
That's perfect. Thank you, Dr. Moxley. I just want to say thank you, especially for those of us who are not from a research background, for enlightening us on the dark side of publication, because I think a lot of us were blissfully unaware of the situation. So thank you so much. It was really interesting. I see there aren't any questions. Can we meet up again at 10 past 12?
See you then.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, is everyone back? Dr. Karis, are you back?
Yes, I'm here, ready to go.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for bearing with us on the Saturday morning. We're about to commence on our last session with Dr. Moxley on part 2 of the overview of the, excuse me, the overview of the publication process. Let's get started on our final session for the morning.
Right, thank you everyone. I hope this is not the graveyard shift. I'm sure your energy is sort of dwindling as we head towards hopefully having a chill Saturday afternoon, so just bear with me for a little bit longer. So just going back to the predatory publishing thing, which is, you know, something that I speak very strongly about because they lure in particularly emerging academics from developing countries, because we are having to pay fees in dollars or pounds or whatever the case might be. Obviously that exchange rate is very difficult. Younger researchers don't necessarily know all these things and can get very easily conned or lured into these aspects. So I hope that by going through this, you just think of it a little more critically. And I had a MMed candidate come to me recently and say, I've just realized that I submitted to a predatory journal after he'd attended one of these sessions. And he said, what do I do now? And sometimes the answer is very little. You have to just let it play out, and you won't be able to put that on your CV if it does ever actually get published anywhere. Otherwise, what you can do is send them an email and say that you request immediate retraction of the paper. If anyone is in that situation, I can send you a template for that. And you do that 3 times if you don't hear back from them, and then keep a record of that. And when you submit to a legitimate journal, you have to tell the editor that this is what's happened, and they need to keep in mind that you're not duplicating the publication. It's just that you submitted to a predatory journal. So there's a whole lot of extra admin, and you can save yourself that headache by going through that process of think, check, and submit very carefully before you decide on a journal to target. Right, so now that we know all of that story and we can be mindful of the pitfalls, is how can I help you navigate the process when you get there? What are the stepwise things that we can look out for at every step of the process, and what happens at every step of the process? So I would love to think that the publication process looks like this, that I work hard, I get my manuscript prepared, I submit it, and then things happen and it gets published and we have a celebration. But actually, it's not that simple, and there are many different steps involved in the publication process, a lot of which takes place, you know, behind the scenes, where you're just waiting patiently for review comments or emails. So I'm going to go through each of these steps with you to help you understand what goes on, and also some things to look out for and tips and tricks for navigating each of these steps. All the things that I've listed in purple are things that the authors will be involved in or will have some sort of responsibility to attend to. Things in green are things that happen behind the scenes, decisions and discussions that take place, you know, at the on the journal side. And then, of course, there are also these external parties, the peer reviewers, the experts that will read your paper and provide comments and a suggestion about whether to reject or accept the paper or request some modifications. So we can break that down into 3, 4, 5 different stages. So let's take a look at each of them now. The first, obviously, is preparing your manuscript, and you know that just saying preparing your manuscript is, you know, a 2-word thing that requires a lot of steps just involved in that specific, you know, process. Writing up your findings, doing your data analysis, getting to a point where you have a first draft, But it's useful to start thinking about which journal you're going to submit to, the early stages of your manuscript writing, because the journal that you've chosen can impact the way that you write up your research. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to take place about which conversation you're going to be joining. And each journal will have a slightly different conversation, and the way you share your message will be slightly different depending on the journal. And your goal is to publish your findings in a fit for purpose journal. And the first thing to say here is that there's often a push to publish internationally, because that also links to the impact factors and the prestige that you'll have in the academic world. But a lot of the research we do here is applicable directly to the local environment. And if you try and submit to an American journal, unless they specifically welcome papers from a low to middle income context, it's going to be immediately rejected, and you would have wasted your time doing that. So I want to say that it's no less prestigious to publish in a local journal. It's not like it's bad, it's poorer science, or it's less than in any way. I want you to publish in a journal that makes the most sense for your readership and where your work is going to have the most impact and relevance. So that's thinking about your audience and your message. Which conversation are you joining? Where is your message the most appropriate? Where is it going to have the most impact? Who is your audience? What message are you going to share with the world? Who is going to find it relevant and appropriate? Which journal would this be a good fit for? And what happens is that you have to reframe your message often if you submit to different journals. So let's take, for example, some work that I do in education. If I submit to a South African Journal of Education, the writing is going to be very tailored to the South African context, but it wasn't accepted there for some reason. So then I targeted the African Journal of Health Professions Education, and I had to rework my introduction to make it applicable to a broader audience, make it more applicable across the continent. So keep that in mind as you go through. It's not going to be one manuscript fits all. What you can do is to start making a list of journals that you think will be a good fit, the types of audiences, the types of journals that you think would be a good fit. And it's a good idea to have about 5 lined up, because it's not a given that you'll be accepted to your first journal. You might have to submit to others. That's fairly normal. Also think about whether those journals are national or international, and how your message might need to be different depending on where you submit. You also need to look at the journal's aims and scope, and I'll show you an example in a second, but the journal will tell you what conversation is taking place there, the types of articles that they welcome, what sorts of topics they're talking about, and you have to think about whether your message will fit into the conversation that's taking place there. And also what you can do is browse the journal and look at the articles that have been published recently. Are there articles that speak to the same sort of topic that you have? And it could be a good idea to keep those on record, because when you submit a cover letter to the journal, you can say, we would love to submit and be considered for your journal, and we see that this would further the conversation or the message that was shared previously by these authors. So you draw that link and motivate for why your article is a good fit. There are different ways or different journal types that we can think about. Sometimes it's just a magazine, so they're not necessarily peer-reviewed. It can be opinion pieces, but it'll be experts in the field that share their information, like the New Scientist or Mental Health Matters. They're more like magazines that you'd find on in your doctor's office, and a way of educating specialists and doctors about the latest developments in the field. these they're not necessarily counted as publications for subsidies. They won't appear on accredited lists necessarily. So actually what you're going to be targeting are these peer-reviewed academic journals. Of course, I mentioned national or international journals. And are you going to target a multidisciplinary journal or something more specialist? So the SAMJ welcomes things across the board, whereas pediatrics and international child health, you're not going to submit something about prostate cancer, for example. I'm just throwing it out there. So think about where your message makes the most sense. Where can you find these journals as you're starting to think about where to submit? Ask your supervisor, ask your colleagues, see where they've submitted. There was mention of the local pediatrics journal earlier. Look at where the articles you're reading have been published. Often you'll see papers coming up from the same sorts of journals. Check them out, see if they're accredited, and look at the impact factors and whatever else and think about submitting there. Check out the list of accredited journals. You can search by, just type in the word pediatrics and it'll bring up all the accredited journals that deal with pediatrics. And I love this DOAJ because that's the one where you can filter for whether to pay or not. So I often go there as a first resource to look for journals. Another great tool, there are a number of them, is on these big publishers like Springer Nature and Elsevier, is they have a tool to help you find a journal. And so you can put in your manuscript title. It doesn't have to be perfect or final. You can also copy and paste your abstract in and search. And based on all the keywords that are coming out in your title and abstract, it will give you some options of where you could submit. And what's nice about these is that they immediately give you the impact factors. So if it comes back as an impact factor of 60, you're not going to be submitting there. It also tells you how long typically it takes for a paper to get through publication. So is it 3 months? Is it typically 9 months? Which can help you decide on your own timeline. Around open access options, and then obviously associated how much it's going to cost. So you can start filtering out the different journals based on all the information that these finders provide. Just to touch on the aim and scope of a journal, because we're talking about where your message fits, which scholarly conversation you're joining, and always go and check out the aim and scope of a journal you think you're going to submit to, and have a look at what conversation is taking place. So the SAMJ says that they're peer-reviewed, they're internationally indexed. You always go and double check if it is. It's a general medical journal accepting things from all over clinical care, but specifically in Africa. They sometimes take articles from other low to middle income countries like India or Brazil, but really the conversation here is Africa. We have general medical content on a spectrum of all these different things. They also include some social sciences stuff, qualitative research, and also economic investigations. So that's pretty cool. If you have done an economic something study, how much something costs, SAMJ would be a good fit because it's telling us that that conversation is taking place. We could then start getting a little more specific. We're going to look at the South African Journal of Child Health, what conversation is taking place there. They're encouraging emerging researchers, and MMed candidates would be examples of an emerging candidate. So things conducted during postgraduate studies, Master of Medicine, a range of different articles that you can submit. And it's devoted to all aspects of health and healthcare of neonates, infants, and children. So that's a pretty specific journal, South African and child health, but it's also welcoming a range of different healthcare aspects for this particular group of patients. We can then start broadening our scope and look at pediatric Surgery International, so broadening scope in terms of its impact globally, but also becoming more specific because now we're focusing on pediatric surgery. So the entire spectrum of pediatric surgery, so think about whether your research fits with surgery or not, and you would bypass this journal if your message doesn't fit with this. Right, so the considerations or things to think about as you're preparing your manuscript would be, what is your message? Who is your audience? Which journal am I going to target? How do I know that my message is going to be a good fit or would be welcomed by that particular journal? The other decisions that you need to make during this process of choosing a journal are the things we've spoken about before, so accreditation, impact factors, and the article processing charges. So again, I'm emphasizing this thing about avoid predatory journals at all costs. So just make sure if there's anything that you check is to check that it is not a predatory journal. And consider the impact factors, as I've mentioned previously. For masters, you're probably looking to target a journal somewhere between like 0.8 to maybe about 5 in terms of impact factor, sometimes higher, but just as a ballpark, this is the typical type of impact factor journal that would be suitable for an MMed project. I'll always say aim high. So when you're ranking your journals or putting a list of 5 together, perhaps rank them in terms of which has the highest impact factor. That's great, but also be realistic. And it doesn't mean to say that your research is any less valuable. It's just about being realistic about where you can publish. Money, money, money. At this point, finding out what the publishing or business model is for that journal. Is it open access? Does it offer hybrid options? Do you have to pay? Is there an incentive for African publishers where you don't need to pay any costs? And what do you need to pay? And I get irritated sometimes because it's not always clear on the journal website and you have to dig around a little bit to find out what the processing costs are, which is again why I like the DOAJ, because it's already done it all for you and it'll appear there. And the big question is, who is going to pay it? If you submit it to a journal, that's going to be 45,000 Rand. Does your supervisor have funds? Is there some sort of fund in your university you can apply for? And that can be a huge disappointment to have gone through the whole peer review process only to get whacked with a bill at the end that you can't pay. We're still talking about manuscript preparation as part of the publication process, and every journal will have different guidelines about how they want their manuscript to be set up. They might request subheadings that are slightly different words. Instead of introduction, they might want to call it background. They'll have word count limitations, referencing, the number of referencing might be limited, all sorts of things, referencing style perhaps that you would need to make sure are in line with the guidelines for the journal. And that can often be an immediate rejection. If you've submitted and the editors look at it and it hasn't adhered to those guidelines, they'll immediately say reject and sort out your paper. So again, every time you submit to a new journal, you're going to have to check that out and make some tweaks to your manuscript. Brenda mentioned earlier the strobe guidelines to make sure that you are including everything you need to in your protocol, but these guidelines are also important at the manuscript writing phase to just make sure that all the information that we need is included in your manuscript. And this is important because if we one day want to use your research in a systematic review, for example, if it hasn't met these guidelines, it's not going to be used, which is a pity. It's for consistent and transparent reporting of things, making sure everything is there so that your manuscript can be understood. I highly encourage the use of template papers. And what I mean by a template paper is that you go and find a published article that very closely resembles your own one. So it doesn't have to be necessarily from the same journal you're going to be submitting to. And it also could be on a slightly different topic, but perhaps it's a retrospective review. Go and find a retrospective review and look at how it's written up. What are the key things that they include? How do they write up their methods? And we learn to write in academia by emulating other people. See from those template papers what the typical structure is, how the content. Also find a recent paper from the sections, what's going on. We can see the layout, eventually what your paper is going to look like, how they format it, and all of this will be linked to the instructions for authors or the guidelines from the journal. And we can also see how the referencing has been set up. So of course, you're not going to be copying and pasting. You're just looking at these papers as a rough guideline of how your own paper is going to look when you submit. Sorry, colleagues, I'm back. Can everyone hear me?
Hi, we can hear you. I think we just temporarily lost connection.
Okay. All right. We're still talking about manuscript preparation, and something just to draw your attention to, don't worry about it now, you'll have my slides, is how are people going to find your article? What are the keywords that readers are going to put into PubMed to find your article? And there's this whole field now in the IT world called search engine optimization. And it's thinking like, how do search engines work? How are they thinking? And how can we exploit that so it makes our research discoverable? And they do this on websites as well. If the WHO are writing new information about COVID, how do they make sure that when someone types in COVID symptoms, that their website will be the first hit on Google? So it's all optimization, and people actually are employed to work on things like this. And we just need to think about the keywords that we use in our title, our abstract, and in the keywords that we finally submit. So the advice is to use as many different keywords and synonyms as possible within these three aspects to make sure that your voice is going to be heard, that your work is going to be discovered. But that is a whole other discussion and just something to bear in mind. Let's look at a quick example. So it's from orthopedics, and I've just highlighted all the keywords that they've used and how the keywords are consistent across the title.
Sorry, Dr. Moxley, do you want to maybe try and reshare your slides? I don't know if I'm the only one who can't see your slides currently.
Sure, sorry about that. Right, so that was just my slide on search engine optimization, which you can read through a bit later. But the example I'm showing is just showing the use of different keywords in a title and in an abstract. I've highlighted all of the similar ones. But what these authors didn't do is they didn't exploit the keyword section. Because when you upload your manuscript, you can have keywords. And they've used the same keywords that they've used everywhere else. So rather what you should do there is find other words, synonyms that you haven't used elsewhere to put in this section, and that will your paper. I won't go into tips for proofreading, but of course, a sloppy manuscript doesn't look good when you've submitted it. So try as far as possible to make sure that your manuscript is top quality in terms of punctuation, grammar, whatever the case might be. Once you've prepared this manuscript and it's in line with all the journal guidelines and you've proofread it and checked it a million times, you can then go through this process of online registration. You'll log in to the journal website and you'll have to create a profile, a username and a password, and then go through the process of submitting your paper. And that can involve a whole long spiel, and you need to set 2 hours aside for it, and sometimes a couple of days if you need to collect some paperwork. And the typical list of documents that you'd need to submit include your original manuscript, a manuscript that's been blinded, which means that any identifying information is removed. So if you're working at Tygerberg Pediatric Unit, you would take out Tygerberg so that the reviewers don't know where you're from. It's just, for bias, to limit bias. The journals will sometimes ask for separate figures and tables. So they've been put into separate documents. Not all journals, but some journals will ask for a cover letter, and that's where you motivate and you say, hello, I've got this great manuscript. This is what I found, and this is why I think it would be a really great fit for the journal. You fill in all the author details. If you've got 5, 10, whatever authors on your paper, you have to sit and put everybody's details in, their title, name, where they're situated, their affiliation. Each of us has a unique ID in the academic world. You need to find out what your co-author's ID is, if they have one. There'll be sometimes a letter that you have to sign, a document that you have to sign that you have gone through the correct ethical procedures, and include your approval letter. You'll have an account form to sign. Often you have to do this even though you're not paying any fees. It's just part of the paperwork. And then a declaration and publication license, which basically says you're no longer going to be the owner of your work. It now belongs to the journal, and you're just declaring that that's okay. And all of this can vary depending on the journal. So you can see that it takes time to now sit and get your head around what it is that they need, and to gather all this documentation and information from your co-authors. I've mentioned the cover letter. It's just a motivation for why the article is a good fit for the journal. So you would specifically use keywords that the journal has used in the aim and scope to show that link. You could also reference previous articles that have appeared within that journal. And yeah, so it's really contributing to how your research is contributing to this conversation within the journal. And of course, requires revision for every new submission. Every new journal will require a new cover letter. It's like job applications, really. Once you've hit submit on the online system, then things start happening behind the scenes. There'll be editors that do a preliminary screening. They'll check things like if you've adhered to the author guidelines, and at that stage, they can immediately reject the paper. And then you go and revise and you submit again. Or if you're feeling really irritated and the screening might say this isn't a good fit for our journal, you will then go and submit elsewhere. If it passes that initial screening, it then gets sent for editorial discussion. Again, they'll talk about, is this a good fit for the journal? Is it worth taking this through peer review? Is this something that we want to see in our journal? And again, they can decide to reject it, or they let you know and they say, cool, thanks for this. We're going to now submit it into peer review. They'll have a list of experts. You can sign up to be a reviewer. Often you'll be requested to be a reviewer, and you'll get sent, the peer reviewers will be sent this document, your manuscript, to be read over, and they have the opportunity to provide comments and ask questions. That goes back to the editors, and the editors take a look and they think, okay, well, based on these reviews, do you think we should reject it? And then it goes back to that cycle again there. Or is it worth giving it back to the authors to make changes and see how they can improve the manuscript? And then they send it back, and there's this back and forth between the editors. Sometimes a paper might they send it back to the experts to double check again. So there can be a number of backs and forths here, and at any point the journal can decide to reject, depending on how things are going. Responding to peer reviewers can be quite an emotional process, because we can be quite angry sometimes about the comments that we get. And not often do we see really harsh reviewer comments. It is possible, doesn't often happen. Reviewers are there to be helpful and constructive. They're not going to waste time praising a manuscript. It takes a long time to review, so they really are just going to get to the critical aspect. And so my suggestion would be to read through the comments and have your frustration and your anger, let it out, have a discussion with your supervisor, and then sleep on it, leave it for a couple of days and look at it again with fresh eyes. And then you can start discussing about what changes you're going to make and how you're going to thank the reviewers and respond politely. This also requires a separate response letter, and it's typically a letter saying, thank you, we really appreciate the reviewer's time, we acknowledge the comments that need to be made, and that can strengthen our paper. And you'll set up a table like this, where you copy and paste the suggestion or question, you write a response, and you say, thanks for this, we agree that we could be more clear about our data analysis, and this is the change that we've made in the manuscript, and then you highlight the track changes within that manuscript. So you just go step by step responding to each of these things. And you don't have to always agree with what the reviewers are saying. So some sentence skeletons that you can use when you agree with your author, the reviewers, to say, we thank the reviewer for pointing this out. We have revised X, Y, Z, or we have removed, we have fixed the error. Thank you. Your observation is correct, etc., etc. But you can also disagree, but you have to provide a really strong motivation for why you are disagreeing. So again, you grovel and you say, thanks for this insightful suggestion. We agree that it would be useful to demonstrate this, but this was beyond the scope of our study. Our aims were only to do this. We recognize it as a limitation, and we've added that to our limitation section. So it's like thanking them, motivating for why you aren't going to change it, and trying to see if there's a compromise that you can make somewhere, if it is a limitation, to just add it to the limitation section. So it's a negotiation, really. Stick with me, we're on the downhill. Once you've gone through that back and forth, one of the best emails in life to receive is, congratulations, we have accepted your manuscript, and we will now go through the final editorial process. And that's definitely a place where you can start celebrating, but the process is not quite done. You'll then be asked either to pay the processing charges. They're not going to send it for editing and layout until those charges have been paid. Or if there are no charges, it'll immediately go into editing and layout. And there'll be editors there who will check through for grammar. They'll start putting the paper together in the format for the journal. And then they'll send you a galley, which is a PDF. It will have all your content and it will look like the publication, but it's just a mock-up. And there'll be questions from the editor saying, I've slightly edited this sentence. Can you just double check that it's still factually correct? Or can you add in, there's something missing from here, or add a symbol into the table? So it's really minor changes. You don't have the opportunity to change your content at that stage. And that can sometimes be a back and forth. And then finally, you get that email that says, congratulations, your publication has now been accepted. You can see it on the website here, and it will look beautiful. You can have a big celebration, but I can guarantee by this stage, having gone through your entire MMed research process, plus submitted and gone through the mill of the publishing process, you kind of feel like this guy at the end, completely shattered, which is totally normal. And now the question is, so given that this publication process can be so long, should you publish before you have your assignment examined for your degree. And increasingly, I see supervisors pressurizing their students to publish before examination. But I think it's a discussion to have very carefully, because you need to be realistic about your timeline. If you've only finished your research in your final year, going through the publication process is going to delay your graduation, because you don't know how long that publication process is going to take. It's difficult to predict. It will be different depending on the journal. A horror story I had with the registrar was that the paper sat in review for 3 years. It wasn't the author's fault, it was the journal's fault. So that's a horror story. I've never seen that ever again, but it can be lengthy. My recommendation was to get it examined first. Get your assignment examined, and then you can have a sigh of relief and then focus on publication after that, because of course we want our specialists out there. We want you to graduate and we want you to register with the HPCSA. You'll see in departments that your option is to go for the traditional thesis format. It's a relatively old-fashioned process where you have chapter 1 is your literature review, chapter 2 is your methods, results, discussion. At UCT, I know you have to submit your protocol and then a manuscript and I think your ethics documentation or something like that. So you need to just double check what the correct format is in your setting. But more and more departments are preferring this format for the final assignment, where the opening pages are just things, you know, your plagiarism declaration, a table of contents, your acknowledgements to thank your husband and your pets. And chapter 1 will be an extended literature review background. And then you'll have your manuscript as chapter 2. And that manuscript can either be publication ready, so if you haven't submitted it for publication yet, it's just, you know, we're going to get this thing through examination first, or you put a copy of the published manuscript as chapter 2. So this is just me showing the difference here is if you've had the time to publish before you need to have the thing examined, you just put a copy of the publication there. But publication ready is the option I would go for. So it means that you've written up the paper, it's almost ready to go for publication, but you just want to get through examination first. And there is a lot of other benefits to this publication ready format instead of the old-fashioned thesis. Some research in South Africa has shown that it's a growing trend. 60% of MMed assignments are in the publication format. The advantages is that it decreases time to completion. It's better to write your manuscript from the get-go rather than a full tilt thesis that you then have to go back to and then transform into a manuscript. Chances are, once you've done with your specialist time, you don't ever want to see that research again. So you're not going to publish it. So just writing a manuscript from the get-go decreases time to your examination. It also helps you when you get to the publication stage because you don't have to convert anything. Of course, it's going to uphold good ethics because it ensures that you're going to publish, and it increases the value to you, obviously, because publications are gold, and obviously it's a monetary incentive for the university. So that's the format that is increasingly encouraged, is publication, not the old-fashioned thesis. Something to think about in different settings is that there's often an institutional repository for all the assignments that have been completed. At UCT, there is one, I can't think of the name now, UCT, but there is an open access repository where you can search for MMed theses and you can check out how other people have laid them out. At Stellenbosch, if there's anyone from my side of the world, it's called Sun Scholar. And I used this recently with my own MPhil. I went and checked out how other people in that department had written up their theses. And I used that also as a type of template when I was writing up my final assignment. So that's all from me. A long story, and there's so much more that I would love to share with you. But for now, a very big thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take questions over the next couple of minutes, and you're more than welcome to contact me if you have any questions about the session or you need any advice. Just drop me an email and I'll respond. Thanks, everyone.